The test is in 4 parts. At the end of the test, you will be given 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the answer sheet. Now turn to Part 1. Part 1. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now we shall begin. You should answer the questions as you listen because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the Continuing Education Department for hosting this series of lectures on people behind the names you thought were fiction. Welcome to this talk on the Grand Old Duke of York. I'm sure you're all familiar with the old nursery rhyme. The Grand Old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill, and he marched them down again, and so on. But did you know that the Duke of York, immortalized in this popular song, was actually Frederick Augustus, second son of King George III of England and Queen Charlotte? He achieved fame in this way because of the humiliation he suffered at the hands of the French during the Revolutionary Wars at the end of the 18th century. Frederick was born on the 16th of August, 1763, and from the age of 17 he had been trained as a soldier. When war broke out between England and France in 1793, his father, the king, insisted that he should command the British contingent that was being dispatched to Flanders to cooperate with the Austrians and the Dutch. The Duke was a brave soldier, but remember he was only 30 at the time. Not only was he young, but he was also inexperienced in battle, and was unable to cope with the enthusiastic French Revolutionary Army. He was let down by his allies too, and in spite of the arrival of 10,000 fresh troops from England, his campaigns were a disaster. He was driven out of Dunkirk in September 1793, Flanders in May 1794, and Belgium in July 1794. Finally, during the winter of 1794 to 1795, his army retreated to the border of Hanover, and, with his unsuccessful campaigns over, the Duke returned to England. It was after this military fiasco that the Duke of York came to be, rather unkindly, satirized in song. Would you believe, despite all this, King George III arranged his son's promotion to the position of Commander-in-Chief of the army in 1798, and in the following year he was appointed to command an army sent to invade Holland. Again he was unsuccessful, and this confirmed the general opinion that he was not capable of commanding an army in the field. Nevertheless, the rhyme is a bit cruel and harsh, because it doesn't take into account the nature of the soldiers who served with Frederick. All the blame for lack of success should not have been attached to the Duke alone, because the army he had under his command was made up from what is commonly described as the scum of the earth. This is a somewhat offensive term, used to refer to a group of people regarded as despicable and worthless. Who were they, these ordinary soldiers? Well, they were mostly vicious, brutal ex-convicts, or raw recruits, and elderly men. The officers who commanded them were all untrained as military men. In fact, they were anybody who could afford to buy a commission.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
But here's the really great thing that, unfortunately, the Duke of York is not remembered for. He realised that this was a hopeless kind of army, and he set about improving conditions in order to recruit higher quality soldiers. He introduced padres. Are you familiar with the term? No? Well, let me explain. You see, members of the British Armed Forces are generally Christians of one denomination or another, and a padre is a Christian cleric or chaplain who ministers to the soldiers and attends to their spiritual needs, without belonging to any particular grouping within the Christian faith. Now, where was I? Yes, Frederick introduced padres, doctors, and veterinary surgeons to the battlefield. Why vets? To attend to the horses, of course. Remember, we're talking about late 18th century battlefields. He was also the founder of the Royal Military College for the training of officers at Sandhurst. Yes, the very same one where the princes and other members of the royal family receive their military training today. Frederick also founded the Duke of York's School in London for sons of soldiers killed in battle. His name is perhaps better commemorated by this school in Chelsea than by the column that stands at the top of Waterloo Steps in St James's Park. In 1807, the Duke was involved in a scandal with a woman, and as a result resigned as Commander-in-Chief. But he was reinstated in 1811 by his elder brother, the Prince Regent, who later became George IV of England. He continued in this post until his death in 1827.
That is the end of section 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 2.
Section 2. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 13. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 13.
My talk today is on anxiety. Anxiety is something you've all experienced at some time in your life, so you'll know that it's an emotional condition in which feelings of dread, fear, and mental agitation predominate. However, what we call an anxiety state or anxiety neurosis or phobic state, they all mean the same thing, is characterized by anxiety reactions far greater than those normally expected for the circumstances, and these reactions may be severe and prolonged. This is the most common form of neurosis in westernized countries. Usually, normal anxiety decreases with repeated exposure to the feared situation, whereas a neurotic anxiety tends to increase. Gradually, the person is inclined to avoid the feared situation and views it with increasing dread. Sometimes there may be an inherited tendency for this, but usually environmental issues are more important. The individual may have been a worrier throughout life, and a stressful condition, just before symptoms set in, is common. Often there is a gradual build-up of anxiety, possibly for weeks or months before the ultimate break occurs. The precipitating cause is usually one of great significance to the patient, often related to personal events, such as bereavement, a breakup, threats to career, health, or personal integrity. What are the symptoms of phobia? Well, phobic states often develop into severe, crippling challenges that can be very difficult to overcome. The person develops a fear of certain situations. It's not uncommon to have one or more of these present at the same time.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 14 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 14 to 20.
I'm going to name some frequent phobias and give you a description of their symptoms. Let's start with agoraphobia, which is when the person has an intense anxiety about venturing outside the safety of the normal home surroundings. It may be impossible for this person to ever go out alone. Their fear of public or open spaces is completely irrational, and they often end up leading very secluded lives. Claustrophobia, on the other hand, is a morbid fear of closed-in areas or places. If you see me taking the stairs instead of the lift, think about it. Am I trying to get more exercise, or am I trying to avoid the confined interior of the lift? And I'm sure you all know people who are afraid of flying. Sometimes it's the fear of being enclosed in the aeroplane itself, and you can imagine how the cramped confines of airline toilets are really bad news for these sufferers. Now I'll move on to discuss social phobia, which, believe it or not, is more common in men. It's an acute anxiety that develops when they are in the presence of others. They feel self-conscious, apprehensive, and embarrassed. If attention, real or imagined, is focused on the sufferer, he becomes uneasy and may blush, stammer, or stutter. Some sufferers even develop tremors, shaking or trembling movements of a part or parts of the body. Or another very common sign of their extreme discomfort is that they perspire profusely on their palms, under their arms, or on their feet. That brings me to the last one that I want to mention today, and that is single phobia. And no, it's not a fear of lifelong bachelorhood. This one is actually precipitated by an acute aversion to dogs, cats, spiders. You may have heard of the term arachnophobia. Well, it applies specifically to spiders, but any single thing can basically cause a strong aversion. Snakes, frogs, mice, or rats, for instance. I can assure you the list is unlimited. You name it, and someone is sure to have a phobia about it. Some people are terrified of the dark, for example, and I'm not talking about young children here. You'd be surprised how many adults are afflicted in this way. Well, I see our time is up. Next week I'll go into some of the treatments and therapies for phobias that have been used over the ages, and some of the relatively new drugs that have recently come on the scene.
That is the end of section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 3. Section 3. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
Good morning. It's good to see so many of you taking an interest in meteorology. As you are all newcomers to the topic, let's keep it simple to start with. In fact, let's begin with a very simple definition of what meteorology is. The suffix, ology, gives you a clue. At least you can all guess that it is the study of something. Meteorology is in fact the scientific study of all changes in the atmosphere, essential for forecasting the weather, of course. And you all know what weather is, right? The four main ingredients are the sun, the atmosphere, water vapor, and the wind. They all come together, disseminating heat from the sun around the globe and making clouds in the layer of the atmosphere directly above the ground, which is called the troposphere. Look up into the sky, and on almost any day of the year, you'll see clouds. Clouds form when water that has evaporated from the surface of the earth condenses onto microscopic dust particles, or other particles, floating in the air. Cloud formation takes different shapes, and they mostly get their names from Latin roots. Now, let's look at the five most basic. We'll start with cumulus, which is a low cloud with a white, puffy appearance, and most often composed of water droplets. It gets its name from cumulo, meaning heap, for its typical piled-up appearance. Now, let's move on to stratus, from strato, meaning layer. These are the gray, horizontal ones, often with a flat base, that you see on an overcast day, and they too are mostly made up of water droplets. At this point, I should mention fog, which you probably don't even think of as clouds, but fog consists of very low-stratus, ground-hugging clouds.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
The high-altitude cirrus cloud, on the other hand, is mostly made of ice crystals and appears wispy and thin, almost hair-like in fact. That's where they get their name, from the word cirro, meaning wisp of hair. They are generally fair-weather clouds. Not so the cumulonimbus, the tallest of all clouds. They extend way up into the troposphere, and these are the ones that produce lightning, thunder, heavy rain, strong winds, and tornadoes. Beware the cumulonimbus. You already know what cumulo means, and it won't surprise you to find out that nimbus means rain, and added as a suffix is an indication of cloud's ability to produce precipitation, which could be rain, snow, or hailstones. As this course progresses, you'll learn a lot more about cloud types, but before I finish today, I want to go back to something I mentioned before, dust. It is generally accepted that when water vapor ascends in the process of cloud formation, it condenses onto dust particles. So it was assumed large dust particles would produce larger droplets and enhance the formation of rain. However, recent research has shown the opposite to be true. Droplet size increases the farther the clouds are from dust-filled air. More dust-reaching rain clouds produces less rainfall. Scientists have shown that as more and more dust enters a rain cloud, the same amount of water becomes spread out. The resulting smaller water droplets scatter instead of combining and growing large enough to make up raindrops. This study shows that higher dust frequency is not inevitably the result of diminished rainfall, but rather its cause. Therefore, loss of topsoil from overgrazing, overcultivation, or bad livestock management in areas neighboring deserts will contribute to the continuing expansion of those arid regions. Your assignment for this week will be to read up on this research and write a report on how dust from damaged land may exacerbate drought conditions and lead to further desertification of arid areas. In other words, how land use has an impact on climate change.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 4. Section 4. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Most people today are familiar with the Aztec Empire, but it may surprise you to know that there is a great deal of disagreement over what kind of an empire it really was. This Aztec Empire history may surprise you. Now let's take a look at an Aztec timeline to get an overview of what happened during the times of this civilization. Collectively, the people of the Allied Central Mexican and American city-states between the 14th century and the 16th century Spanish invasion are commonly referred to as the Aztecs. The Aztec Empire was controlled primarily by a political body called the Triple Alliance. The Aztecs' capital city was located at Tenochtitlan, which is the site of the modern Mexico City, and their empire covered nearly all of the current country of Mexico, extending down into other regions of Central America as well. Then, progressing to the subject of food. Aztec food was a rich combination of many foods that we take for granted today. Not only is much of this rich diet still common in Mexico today, it spread around the world. Let's look at some of what the ancient Mexica peoples ate. Maize was the staple grain of the Aztec Empire. Maize has been domesticated for thousands of years, and it likely first came into common use in Mexico, spreading to the rest of the world from there. Mexico is still one of the world's top maize-growing countries. Aztec food also included beans and squash. Of course, maize and beans are still a cornerstone of the Mexican diet. A healthy combination, especially if you're not eating a lot of meat. Okay, now, moving forward onto the area of clothing. Ancient Aztec clothing, that is, the clothing worn by the tribes that made up the Aztec Empire, such as the Mexica people, was rich in variety, and more importantly, it varied according to the social class that people belonged to. Ancient Aztec clothing was generally loose-fitting and did not completely cover the body. When the Spanish arrived in Mexico, the people were surprised to see them in their full armor, with only their faces exposed. Aztec clothes were generally made of cotton, which was imported, or ayat fiber, made from the magui cactus. Women would weave the fibers into clothing, a task girls were taught as young teenagers. Because of their vast trading network, the Aztecs were able to make use of a beautiful array of dyes, creating the brilliant colors still seen in Mexico today. Next, let's look at the education situation of the Aztec. The Mexican people of the Aztec Empire had compulsory education for everyone, regardless of gender or class. In the end, people in the Aztec society were generally well educated, though boys received a wider education than girls. Girls were taught how to run a home, cook, and care for a family, but they were also taught things like crafts and ways to economically run the home. In this way, women had a lot of power in society, though it was behind the scenes. Boys learned other trades and were also taught fighting skills and leadership skills. Finally, then, let's look at Aztec temples. Aztec temples were called by the Mexican people of the empire Teocalli god houses. The priests of the Aztec religion went to these temples to worship and pray, and make offerings to the gods to keep them strong and in balance. How did they send their tribute? Well, Aztecs collected tribute from the various parts of Mexico that fell under their control. Much of this tribute was in the form of agricultural produce, such as cotton, maize, and beans, which supplemented the agricultural yield in and around Mexico Tenochtitlan. Tribute payers were also obliged to produce certain quantities of rare and precious goods. According to the tribute list preserved in the Codex Mendoza, these included jaguar pelts, deer skins, rubber, feathers, gold, jade, turquoise, seashells, warrior costumes, and even live eagles.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers. That is the end of the listening test. In the IELTS test, you would now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the answer sheet.